People mocked Carter Miller, a 36-year-old single dad, for dating Audrey Constance, a paralyzed woman in a wheelchair who could not move her legs after a tragic accident. They laughed at the couple at the diner, whispered at the elementary school gate, and made cruel jokes at the garage where Carter worked with his oil-stained hands. But on one defining evening, in front of everyone who had ever ridiculed them, Audrey looked into Carter's eyes with trembling hands and a steady voice, and confessed a secret she had buried for years. Her words made Carter cry, silenced the entire restaurant, and overturned every assumption about the woman in the wheelchair. Carter Miller stood at 36 years old with broad shoulders shaped by manual labor hands, calloused from years of turning wrenches and changing oil at the garage on Cedar Valley's main road. His brown eyes carried a perpetual gentleness mixed with exhaustion, the kind that came from raising a 7-year-old son alone while trying to outrun the ghost of a failed marriage. The small rented house on the outskirts of town held mismatched furniture and toys scattered across worn carpet, but the walls displayed Leo's crayon drawings like a private gallery. Each morning, Carter woke before dawn to pack lunchboxes, tie shoelaces, and deliver his son to school before clocking in at the garage where customers sometimes forgot his name but always remembered he was just the mechanic. His ex-wife had left 3 years earlier with a man who wore pressed suits and owned property downtown. Her family had made their feelings clear during the divorce voices, dripping with disdain as they called Carter inadequate, a man with grease under his fingernails and no ambition beyond fixing other people's broken engines. The words had carved themselves into his chest, creating a quiet belief that he deserved nothing more than survival. Romance felt like a luxury meant for people who did not smell like motor oil at the end of each day. Leo Miller had inherited his father's brown eyes, but possessed a brightness Carter had forgotten he once carried. The 7-year-old spent afternoons in the corner of the garage drawing superheroes and race cars on scraps of paper while his father worked beneath vehicles. He was small for his age, but quick with words, always asking questions about why engines made certain sounds, or whether clouds ever got tired of floating. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Carter cooked simple meals, and sometimes Leo would look up and ask if his dad had any friends. The question always made Carter's throat tighten because the boy was too young to understand that loneliness had become as familiar as breathing. Audrey Constance lived in a ground-floor apartment 3 blocks from the town square. Her chestnut hair usually pulled back in a loose braid that fell across one shoulder. At 33, she possessed the kind of beauty that startled people before they noticed the wheelchair, a delicate face with eyes the color of winter mornings. The apartment walls held paintings she had created over the years, landscapes and figures frozen mid-dance, ghostly legs captured in brushstrokes she could no longer command with her own body. Before the accident, she had been a ballet dancer, someone who understood flight through the architecture of muscle and balance. Photographs tucked in a drawer showed her in white costumes under stage lights, arms extended like wings, audiences on their feet applauding a grace that had been stolen in one rainy collision. She had learned to paint after the doctors explained she would never walk again, sitting in rehabilitation centers with watercolors and cheap canvases trying to capture the sensation of movement her body remembered but could no longer perform. Some days she wondered if she still counted as feminine, if the woman she had been still existed inside this new vessel that required ramps and wide doorways. But she kept painting, kept waking up, kept finding small reasons to believe she deserved more than pity. Cedar Valley was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone's business before breakfast ended. The diner near the courthouse served as unofficial headquarters for gossip waitresses pouring coffee while customers dissected their neighbors' mistakes and misfortunes. People measured worth in paychecks and property and surnames and who attended which church on Sunday mornings. They were polite to your face but ruthless behind closed doors, a community that valued appearance over integrity and assumed anyone struggling must have deserved their struggles. Carter first encountered Audrey on a Thursday evening when he spotted her on the sidewalk struggling to retrieve a shopping bag that had slipped from her wheelchair. Pedestrians streamed past without slowing, eyes sliding away from the scene as if stopping might implicate them in some unnamed crime. He pulled his truck to the curb and jogged over, crouching to gather the scattered items without making a spectacle of the moment. When he asked if she was all right, he looked directly at her face rather than staring at the wheelchair the way most people did. She noticed the difference, immediately saw genuine concern rather than performative compassion, and introduced herself with a hesitant smile. As he drove away minutes later, glancing in the rearview mirror to see her waving, Carter did not realize that small encounter would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The second time they met felt less accidental. Carter found himself driving past her neighborhood more frequently, making excuses about traffic patterns and nearby stores that saved time. He helped her carry groceries up a sloped entrance, fixed a loose support bracket on her wheelchair, and repaired a dripping faucet in her kitchen when she mentioned it casually. Their conversations began on doorsteps and gradually moved inside, stretching from polite small talk into genuine exchanges about music and art, and the weight of carrying histories no one else could see. Audrey played classical piano recordings while showing him paintings she had never displayed publicly, canvases depicting invisible legs and wheelchairs sprouting wings, images of falling and rising that existed only in her imagination. Carter told her about Leo, about the drawings taped to their refrigerator, and the way his son asked impossible questions about stars and death and whether broken things could ever be completely fixed. She shared carefully edited stories about her parents, now elderly and anxious, who called every other day to make sure she was eating enough and staying safe. He began to realize that she was not fragile the way people assumed. She was sharp and funny, opinionated about films, and fiercely protective of her independence. She did not want rescuing. She wanted to be seen as whole rather than damaged, to be known for who she was rather than what had been taken from her. Carter understood that hunger because he carried his own, the desperate need to be valued beyond the grease stains, and the modest paycheck to matter as more than just a single dad who never quite measured up. One afternoon, gathering courage like loose change, he asked if she wanted to get coffee. They went to the park first, where he pushed her wheelchair along paved paths beneath autumn trees, then stopped at a small cafe where other customers glanced over with curious expressions. Some looks held pity, others confusion. A few carried judgment wrapped in tight smiles. Carter tried to ignore the attention focusing on Audrey's voice as she described a painting she was planning, but he felt the weight of those stares like hands pressing on his shoulders. When he drove her home that evening, he hesitated before asking if she would let him take her to dinner sometime. The question came out awkward and rushed his fingers gripping the steering wheel too tightly, but Audrey's smile was genuine when she said yes. She had been waiting for him to ask, had been hoping he would see her as someone worth courting rather than someone to be handled carefully like antique glass. The rumors began that same week. A group of regular customers at the diner spotted Carter guiding Audrey inside, pulling out a chair and ordering for both of them with the easy familiarity of people who had shared multiple meals together. Voices dropped to whispers, glances exchanged across booths, phones pulled from pockets to text friends about what they were witnessing. By the next morning, half the town knew that the mechanic was dating the paralyzed woman, and opinions spread like oil stains across concrete. Carter caught fragments of conversations when he stood in line to pay their bill, heard someone murmur about pity and desperation. His jaw tightened, fingers clenching the receipt, but he said nothing, because he did not want Audrey to know how cruel strangers could be over things that were none of their concern. He told himself that gossip was meaningless, that people always needed something to talk about, but the words still burrowed under his skin like splinters he could not extract. Years earlier, Carter had been married to a woman whose beauty had made him feel lucky every single day until it no longer did. She had grown tired of their small house and smaller income, frustrated by a husband who came home smelling like motor oil and talking about brake pads instead of vacations and investments. Her family had never hidden their disappointment, making comments at holidays about how their daughter deserved better, how Carter lacked ambition and vision and any real future worth mentioning. The marriage ended on a Tuesday afternoon when she announced she was leaving suitcases already packed in the car, a new relationship already underway with someone who owned things and went places and did not have to wash his hands 3 times to get them clean. She left Leo behind, saying she was not ready to be a full-time mother, that the boy would be better off with his father anyway. Carter had stood in the driveway holding his crying son while watching her taillights disappear, and something inside him had calcified into the certainty that he would never be enough for anyone. The words she had spoken during their final argument became a voice in his head that activated whenever he tried to imagine being happy. "You are just a mechanic. You will never be good enough. You do not deserve better than this." Those sentences played on repeat, convincing him that loving Audrey was selfish because it would drag her into the judgment and ridicule he had learned to expect as the natural consequence of his existence. He worried that if people mocked their relationship, Audrey would become a target for cruelty she did not deserve. He worried that Leo would overhear classmates making fun of his dad for dating a woman in a wheelchair, that his son would be bullied because Carter could not protect him from the ugliness of small-town gossip. So he kept their relationship quiet, avoided too much physical affection in public, and never mentioned her when people asked about his personal life. He thought he was being protective. He did not realize he was being cowardly. Audrey's life had split into before and after on a rainy April night 6 years earlier. Before the accident, she had been a professional dancer, someone who lived inside music and movement, whose body was an instrument she had spent 2 decades perfecting. The performance that evening had gone beautifully, the audience standing to applaud as she took her bows in a white costume that caught the stage lights like snow. Driving home afterward, she had been replaying the choreography in her mind, barely noticing the rain until headlights appeared in her peripheral vision, moving too fast, crossing into her lane, the impact arriving before she could even scream. Glass shattered inward. Metal shrieked and crumpled. Her spine compressed in ways spines were never meant to compress. And when she woke 3 days later in a hospital bed surrounded by machines, a doctor with kind eyes explained that she would never dance again. She would never walk again. Her legs had become decorative weight she would carry for the rest of her life, flesh and bone that no longer answered to her brain's commands. The driver who hit her was Clinton Corbin, younger brother of Mayor George Henry. He had been drunk running a red light and should have faced serious criminal charges. But his family was powerful and connected, and within days attorneys arrived with folders full of paperwork. They offered Audrey's parents a substantial settlement in exchange for silence, suggesting that a trial would be expensive and traumatic and unlikely to change the outcome. Her body was already broken. Did she really want to break her family financially as well, trying to punish someone whose lawyers would bury them in motions and delays? Audrey had signed the agreement in a fog of pain medication and despair, taking the money and promising never to speak publicly about who had caused the accident. She told herself it was practical, that her parents needed the financial security and she needed to focus on learning to live in a body that no longer worked the way bodies should. But the silence aided her like acid, corroding her sense of self until she began to wonder if staying quiet made her complicit in her own erasure. The depression that followed was darker than the accident itself. She stopped seeing friends, stopped answering calls, stopped believing she had any value beyond what she had lost. Only painting saved her, giving her hands something to do while her legs atrophied and her heart tried to remember why it should keep beating. Each canvas became a small rebellion against the narrative that she was finished, used up, no longer capable of creating beauty. She never told anyone about Clinton Corbin because she feared what would happen if she did. His family could destroy her reputation, could paint her as a liar looking for attention or more money. And deeper than that, fear was the terror that Carter would see her differently if he knew the full truth, would view her as a victim rather than a partner, someone to be protected rather than loved. So she kept the secret locked away and tried to build a new life on top of the ruins of the old one. Months into their relationship, Audrey asked Carter if she could meet Leo properly, not as his father's friend, but as someone important in his life. Carter hesitated, making excuses about timing and Leo's age, saying they should take things slowly. But Audrey heard what he was not saying, recognized the fear that their relationship might end and leave his son confused and hurt. She understood his caution, but it still stung, still felt like evidence that he saw her as temporary rather than permanent. Then someone posted a photograph taken without permission. A group of women who frequented the diner had captured an image of Carter pushing Audrey's wheelchair through the parking lot, heads bent close in conversation, completely unaware they were being watched. The photo appeared online with a mocking caption about desperation and poor choices, and within hours it had been shared across the town's networks. Comments appeared beneath the image, strangers and acquaintances alike making jokes about the mechanic who could not do better than a paralyzed woman questioning whether he was looking for a caretaker or just someone too damaged to leave him. The cruelty was casual and comprehensive, the kind of thoughtless violence people committed when they forgot that photographs represented real humans with feelings and histories. The photo made its way into a group used by parents at Leo's elementary school. The boy saw it when a classmate's mother opened her phone at pickup time, recognized his father's truck in the background. Over the next few days, he heard whispers and endured questions from other children who had overheard their parents talking. Someone called his dad weird for dating a woman who could not walk. Someone else asked why his father bothered with someone broken. Leo said nothing to Carter or Audrey, afraid that telling them would make them sad, carrying the hurt alone the way children do when they think they are protecting the adults they love. Audrey discovered the post when a former colleague sent her the link with an apology and a note saying she deserved better than this kind of treatment. Reading the comments felt like being in the accident all over again. The same crushing weight and inability to breathe, the same sense that her body had betrayed her into a life where people saw her as a punchline rather than a person. She stared at the screen for a long time, wondering if loving Carter was selfish, if she was ruining his life and his son's life just by existing in proximity to them. That evening, she confronted Carter with the question she had been avoiding for weeks. "Do you actually want to be with me? Or do you just feel sorry for me?" He fumbled for an answer, wanting to explain that he was afraid of people hurting her and Leo, that his silence was meant to be protective rather than shameful. But the words would not come, and his hesitation spoke louder than any explanation could have. To Audrey, his silence confirmed what she had feared all along. He was embarrassed. He did not want to be seen with her because being with her made him a target for the same mockery she faced every day. She did not break up with him that night, but something fractured between them, a crack that would either heal or widen depending on what happened next. The diner was crowded on Friday evening when Carter took Leo out for burgers, wanting to make up for the week's tensions with an easy meal and his son's favorite milkshake. The restaurant hummed with conversation and the clatter of dishes, booths filled with families and couples and groups of friends dissecting their week. A few people recognized Carter from the photograph glances sliding toward him and then away whispers passed behind hands. He tried to ignore the attention focusing on Leo's excited chatter about a drawing he had made at school. Across town, Audrey's best friend was trying to coax her out of the apartment, insisting that hiding would only make the gossip worse. Reluctantly, Audrey agreed to dinner, letting herself be pushed through streets she usually avoided, trying to pretend she did not notice people staring. When they reached the diner and opened the door, the first thing Audrey saw was Carter and Leo sitting near the window, the boy swinging his legs beneath the table while his father cut a burger into smaller pieces. The air seemed to thicken. Carter looked up and froze, his expression caught between surprise and something close to panic. Around them, conversations paused as people recognized the woman from the photograph, the paralyzed dancer everyone had been talking about all week. Phones appeared in hands not even trying to be subtle. Cameras pointed like weapons waiting to capture whatever happened next. Leo spotted Audrey and waved, his face breaking into an innocent grin, completely unaware of the tension crackling through the room. Audrey felt her friend's hand on her shoulder, asking quietly if she wanted to leave, but something hardened in her chest. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting fear dictate whether she deserved to exist in public spaces. She asked her friend to wheel her over to Carter's table, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. The diner fell silent, everyone watching as she approached. Carter stood awkwardly, trying to smile, uncertain what to say or how to explain this collision of his two worlds. Audrey looked at him with an expression he could not read, then turned her attention to the room at large. She asked Carter, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet space, if he minded if she said something in front of everyone. He nodded, too stunned to do anything else, and the audience leaned in, waiting for the scene to unfold. Audrey began by addressing the strangers who had spent the week dissecting her relationship like it was entertainment provided for their amusement. She said that many of them had laughed at her for being in a wheelchair, had mocked Carter for choosing to be with her, had reduced their entire relationship to a joke about desperation and pity. Her voice did not waver even though her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair hard enough to make her knuckles white. She told them she did not need anyone's pity. She had chosen Carter just as deliberately as he had chosen her, and neither of them required permission or approval from people who knew nothing about their lives. Then she spoke about Carter himself, and her voice softened into something that made his chest ache. She said he was the first person in 6 years who had looked at her like a human being rather than a tragedy. He did not ask invasive questions about her accident or treat her like she was made of glass. He asked if she was tired, if she needed anything, if she wanted company, or preferred to be alone. He held doors because he held doors for everyone, not because he thought she was helpless. He saw her, really saw her in a way most people never bothered to. The room stayed silent, some faces flushing with shame, others still skeptical and waiting for more. Audrey took a breath that seemed to pull air from the bottom of her lungs, and then she said the thing she had been too afraid to say for 6 years. The person who caused the accident that paralyzed her was Clinton Corbin, brother of Mayor George Henry. She had been paid to stay silent, had signed legal documents promising never to name him publicly, but she was done protecting people who had never protected her. Gasps rippled through the diner. Phones that had been recording casually suddenly became focused people checking to make sure they were capturing this confession. Audrey continued explaining that Clinton had been drunk, that he had run a red light, that his family's lawyers had buried the case under money and threats before it could ever reach a courtroom. She had stayed quiet because she was afraid no one would believe a paralyzed woman accusing a powerful man, because she thought silence was the price of survival. She turned back to Carter, and her eyes were wet, but her voice remained steady. She told him she had accepted that she would never walk again, had made peace with the body she now inhabited. But what she could not accept was being with someone who was afraid to stand beside her. If he was ashamed of their relationship, she would leave, and he would never have to worry about people judging him for being with the woman in the wheelchair. But if he could hold her hand right now in front of everyone who had spent the week mocking them, she would never let him go. Carter's vision blurred with tears he did not bother to hide. He was crying because he was ashamed of himself, because Audrey had just displayed more courage in 5 minutes than he had managed in his entire life. He was crying because she had been carrying this secret alone, had been protecting him from judgment. He had been too weak to face himself. He stepped forward and took both her hands in his, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. Before he could speak, Leo climbed down from his chair and wrapped his arms around Audrey's shoulders. The 7-year-old said loud enough for half the diner to hear that he did not think she was weak at all. He thought she was the bravest person in the whole restaurant, braver than all the adults who had been saying mean things when they thought nobody important was listening. The simplicity of the child's declaration cracked something open in the room. A few people wiped their eyes. Others looked down at their plates, suddenly unable to meet anyone's gaze. One older woman stood and started clapping slowly, and within seconds others joined until the sound filled the space like an apology. The door opened and Clinton Corbin walked in with 2 friends, all 3 men dressed in expensive casual clothes, talking loudly about a golf game. Clinton stopped mid-sentence when he registered the unusual silence, saw all the faces turn toward him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Someone called out his name, asking if he was Clinton Corbin, brother of Mayor George Henry. He nodded, warily, confusion crossing his features, and then someone else shouted that the woman in the wheelchair had just accused him of being the drunk driver who destroyed her life. Clinton's face went pale, then flushed dark red. He forced a laugh and said the accusation was ridiculous, that whatever this woman was claiming had been investigated and resolved years ago. But Audrey's voice cut through his deflection like a blade. She described the white dress she had been wearing, now soaked with blood and rain. She described the smell of alcohol that had poured from his car when emergency responders pried open the door. She recited details that only someone who had been there could know, details that made Clinton's protests sound hollow even to his friends. Someone in the back announced they were recording everything, that the video was already being shared, that people who actually cared about truth and justice were watching right now. Another customer stood and identified himself as a retired mechanic who had been paid to quietly repair Clinton's vehicle the week after the accident, who remembered the damage to the front end and the tickets scattered across the passenger seat, evidence of a man who drove recklessly as a matter of habit. Clinton tried to leave, but found his path blocked by people who had gone from spectators to witnesses who suddenly understood they were watching something bigger than small-town gossip. His carefully constructed shield of money and family name was cracking in real time, and there was nowhere to hide in a room full of phones capturing his every word and expression. Audrey looked at him without hate, just exhausted finality. She told him he had taken her legs, but he had lived comfortably ever since, protected by lawyers and silence and the assumption that powerful people did not have to face consequences. She was not asking for her legs back because that was impossible. But she was taking back her voice, the one thing she still controlled, and she was done letting him pretend he had not destroyed her life for no reason beyond his own carelessness. Carter stood beside her chair, one hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than inadequate. He felt proud to be associated with her, proud that she had chosen him, determined to make sure she never regretted that choice. Within hours, the video from the diner had spread beyond Cedar Valley's borders. News outlets picked up the story of the paralyzed dancer confronting her wealthy assailant in a public restaurant, the footage showing Clinton's face as he realized his secret was no longer secret. Pressure mounted on local authorities to reopen the case to investigate why it had been closed so quietly in the first place, to determine whether the Corbin family had used influence to obstruct justice. The police announced they were reviewing all available evidence and interviewing witnesses who had stayed silent for years out of fear or money, or both. The mechanic who had repaired Clinton's car provided documentation he had kept despite being told to destroy it. Photographs of the damage and receipts that placed the vehicle at his shop days after the accident. Other people came forward with stories of Clinton's drinking, his habit of driving recklessly, incidents that had been swept under rugs and sealed behind settlements. Clinton Corbin was taken into custody 3 days later. The image of him being led to a police car in handcuffs appearing on front pages and news broadcasts. Mayor George Henry released a statement saying his brother would cooperate fully with investigators, though the careful wording made it clear the family was already assembling legal defenses. Justice moved slowly, but it was moving, and that felt like something. Carter found Audrey in her apartment the evening after Clinton's arrest. He knelt beside her wheelchair and took her hands, his voice breaking as he apologized for every time he had let fear silence him, for every moment he had prioritized his own comfort over her dignity. He had thought staying quiet would protect her from gossip and cruelty, but all he had done was make her feel alone. He had been protecting himself, protecting his pride, too afraid of being mocked to stand up for the person he loved. Audrey listened with tears sliding down her face, not because she was sad, but because she felt seen in a way she had stopped believing was possible. She told him she understood fear, that she had spent 6 years being afraid, but fear had kept both of them small when they could have been helping each other grow. She did not want to waste any more time hiding from people whose opinions meant nothing. Over the next few weeks, people in Cedar Valley began approaching Audrey to apologize. Some were genuine, admitting they had judged without knowing the full story, that they had let cruelty disguise itself as entertainment. Others apologized because the whole town was watching now, and being publicly kind seemed safer than being exposed as callous. Audrey accepted the apologies with grace, saying that if even one person learned something about making assumptions, then maybe all the pain had served some purpose. Leo drew a picture that he insisted Audrey hang in her apartment. It showed 3 figures holding hands, a tall man, a woman in a wheelchair, and a small boy in the middle connecting them. He told her it was their family, the one he wanted, and both adults cried while he looked on with the confusion of someone too young to understand why happiness sometimes looked like sadness. Several months later, Audrey opened a small gallery in a storefront near the town square. The space showcased her paintings alongside work from other local artists, but the centerpiece was a canvas titled Home. It depicted 3 figures silhouetted against a sunset, 2 adults and a child, their hands linked and their shadows stretching long across painted ground. She had worked on it for weeks, pouring every complicated feeling about family and belonging into brushstrokes that somehow captured both fragility and strength. Carter helped transform the empty shop into a gallery, building display walls and installing lighting, repairing everything that needed fixing. Leo ran through the space, leaving sticky fingerprints on windows and asking 1,000 questions about art and color and why some paintings made people cry. The opening reception drew a surprising crowd. People coming to see the woman who had stood up to power, who had refused to disappear just because it would have been more convenient for everyone else. On a quiet afternoon after the last visitor had left, Carter asked Leo to give them a few minutes alone. The boy nodded and went to draw in the corner accustomed to adults needing private conversations. Carter wheeled Audrey to stand in front of the painting titled Home, and then he did something he had never imagined himself capable of. He knelt down so their eyes were level and pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. His hands shook, but his voice held steady as he told her he had spent most of his life believing he was only good enough for an ordinary existence. He had thought people like him did not get to be happy, did not deserve love or partnership or futures that looked different from their pasts. But she had shown him that even when the body could not walk, the heart could still travel incredible distances if it had someone to travel with. He asked if she would let him call her home for the rest of his life, if she would marry him and build something permanent out of all the broken pieces they had each been carrying alone. The ring was simple, nothing expensive or flashy, just a silver band that caught the gallery lights and threw small reflections across her face. Audrey cried, and for once the tears were uncomplicated by pain or fear or anger. She thought about the night of the accident, about lying in the hospital, learning her legs would never work again, about signing papers that promised her silence in exchange for survival. She thought about every day she had wondered if she was still worthy of love, still capable of being someone's partner rather than someone's burden. And she thought about the afternoon Carter had stopped to help her pick up a fallen shopping bag, seeing her as a person before he saw the wheelchair. She said yes. She said she had lost the ability to stand, but she had found a place where her heart could rest, and that was worth more than any physical foundation. Leo heard her answer and came running, throwing himself at both of them and shouting that he finally had a real family, one that belonged to him and would not leave. The final image was almost too perfect to be real, but it was real anyway. Carter pushed Audrey's wheelchair through the park on a cool autumn evening, Leo running ahead with a kite shaped like a bird, its tail streaming colors against the dimming sky. A few people they passed smiled and nodded, not with pity, but with something closer to respect, recognition that the three of them had fought for the right to be together and won. People had mocked the mechanic for loving a woman who could not walk, had reduced their relationship to a joke about desperation and damaged goods. But in the end, Audrey had been the strongest person in Cedar Valley, and their love had been the most whole thing in a town full of people with perfectly functional legs and deeply broken hearts.